afternoon. This is the presentation with an unwieldy title, but is the intersection of positive youth development and culturally sustained pedagogy, thinking through implications of those two theoretical frameworks for school structure, community engagement, and literacy education or language acquisition. Our agenda today, we're going to walk through those two theoretical frameworks that we have, the positive youth development component and the culturally sustaining pedagogy, before moving into each of our areas for implications. And keep your notebook ready because we'll have implications for you as educators along the way. To start, positive youth development is one of our first theoretical frameworks. This arose in the late 90s as a result or a bit of a pushback against what was known as a risk and resilience paradigm. This was conceptualizing children or youth in general as, people prone to risk and prone to sort of like debilitating or antisocial behaviors such as alcohol abuse, other substance abuse, and other things that you just don't want kids to do, I suppose. But the reconceptualization occurred beginning with the Search Institute and a couple other researchers that were positioning or trying to reorient the field towards children's assets, what they offer, what they bring to the table, in a more of a strengths-based approach, focusing on the positive versus the negative. The initial research came up with roughly 40 areas, external and internal assets for positive youth development. They range from very different things that are entirely too many to talk about in this presentation. So we've chosen to distill them, as has the psychology literature up to this point. So from the 40 developmental traits, it's been distilled, and from case studies came up with 5 areas of growth that are a little bit easier to focus on. Those are known as the 5 C's. These are care, character, connection, competence, and confidence. These, rather than assets of the actual child, these are areas of focus for us as educators that we can think about if we choose to foster, and if we try to foster these in our students, they tend to turn out a little bit better than they would have otherwise. So we focus on care, making sure the child feels loved and known, seen in our classrooms. Character, this refers to sort of the non-cognitive abilities of our students, their ability to persevere in difficult situations. Connection means that they find meaning in both what they're doing and the people they're with. Competence, we foster high expectations of them, and they rise to meet them, and they feel confident about their ability to pursue those things. This was a development in the mid-2000s within the psychology literature, but the field has kept moving ever since. And so the final component that we want to talk about is fostering critical consciousness, or what's known as critical positive youth development. This came out of Gonzalez's work just recently. And in addition to those 5 C's, we're adding a 6th one of critical consciousness. This means that students are able to locate themselves within a larger social structure, within social hierarchies that have been built up over time in various systems of oppression, etc. There are some subsets to C's that we can think of. One being critical reflection. That's the ability that I was just talking about, locating yourself within a structure, and then contribution. How do you turn that into action after that? So in addition to those 5 C's, trying to foster or focus on this critical consciousness component is largely where culturally sustaining pedagogy overlaps with positive youth development, and where most of our presentation will be going following my contributions. Culturally sustained pedagogy follows a similar or a parallel arc, but within the education literature as opposed to the psychology literature. So late 20th century, there are a lot of different approaches that were being thrown around in terms of trying to make curriculum meaningful for students. Culturally appropriate, congruent, responsive, compatible. These were all terms that were being thrown around until Gloria Ladson-Billings came through and began to critique some of these. I'm gonna read this quote in full because I think it unpacks a lot better than what I could paraphrase. Each of these pedagogies locates the source of student failure and subsequent achievement within the nexus of speech and language interaction patterns of students and teachers. They suggest that student success, so defined, is represented in achievement within the social structures excellent in schools, meaning the dominant paradigm that may be there. But then the goal of education is just to fit students within that achievement structure. They construct students as others by virtue of their race, ethnicity, or social class. Ladson-Billings' big pushback was to create a culturally, what she termed, relevant pedagogy. It addresses student achievement, tries to get students to move the needle on that, but it also helps students to accept and affirm their cultural identity while developing critical perspectives. This is that critical consciousness component to challenge inequities within that school. Culturally relevant pedagogy has been the term du jour for most of the 21st century, but recently Paris and Alim, 2 researchers that you'll probably read in Ed Psych if you haven't already, have tried to push the field a little bit further into culturally sustaining pedagogy. This takes a more explicit focus on youth and what youth bring to the table. Culturally relevant pedagogy more or less features on sort of heritage and traditions within certain racial and ethnic groups, whereas culturally sustaining pedagogy looks to mobilize that along with how youth modulate their cultures in their own distinct ways. So a separate focus on youth identity and cultural practices as distinct from their parents or other people, focusing on that as an asset rather than a deficit. And at the same time, embracing the big term here is use counter-hegemonic potential, the ability for youth to push back against the power structures that they see and live within. There's a little caveat that goes along with this, that youth culture, just because it's youth, just because they're young and they're doing things and we are here to love and care for them, doesn't mean that there aren't things to pay attention to as well, things to critique, to make sure we curb them and move them into in a developmentally appropriate and loving way. Youth culture isn't perfect, but by the same time, it is no means a deficit. It's an asset that can be used to move our students along in their educations. So the thing we were talking about when we wanted you to take out your notes, we know that there's a lot of jargon going on, a lot of unwieldy things. As we move further into our implications, there's going to be a little bit more of that. But the C's that you need to take care of are the ones that you see on your screen right now: character, connection, competence, confidence, and critical consciousness. If you want to, you can pause the video at this moment to create some sort of version of this chart in your notes. We will be filling it up as we go along so you can keep track of your implications.
Hi everyone, I'm Kate. I'm going to talk about the community engagement implications of PYD and CSP. So I'm sure we've all heard the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child, and it works beautifully with CSP and PYD because the children thrive best when they feel some sort of support and empowerment from the spheres that they inhabit. So as you can see from each of these circles here, there's overlapping spaces, and every of these spaces, so school, family, and church, work together to help the child and support the child. Adolescent development occurs in an ecology, and this is part of the ecology, the mesosystem. And the mesosystem is defined as the strength of the connection among the locations where the child inhabits. So what we have found in the literature is that community engagement in adolescent schooling is crucial to their successful development. And this implicitly and explicitly aligns beautifully with PYD and CSP. So for the Catholic School Advantage, as it relates to community engagement, we know the Catholic School Advantage promotes the mesosystem and integration of the spheres here. And so Catholic schools obviously by nature have a really cool opportunity and privilege to do community engagement very well, as most Catholic schools are connected to a parish. So they can really work within that smaller space that interconnects school, family, and church, which is great. And we also know that parents are the primary educators of the child. And so including parents in the learning that your students are doing in the classroom is of the utmost importance. So for some quick term defining as I go through this section, community is defined as a group of people who share certain practices that both define the community and are nurtured by it. It includes people who typically develop a sense of belonging by virtue of geographic locations, such as neighborhoods, or cultural affinity, such as language, ethnicity, and religion. What's important in this definition is the part that says the group of people share certain practices that both define the community and are nurtured by it. So that sort of tells us that the community is self-giving and the benefits are self-perpetuating when everyone is involved. Community engagement is the shared responsibility of community members and families to be involved in and support children's learning in order to improve academic performance and cultivate a sense of empowerment. Empowerment can be connected here to one of the 5 C's, confidence in the child. And so you'll see implicit throughout this section some of those 5 C's. So next, why is community engagement important through the lenses of PYD and CSP? PYD and CSP make strong cases for the need for community engagement with the school to be consistent and stable. So starting with PYD, I specifically see a few of the C's here: confidence, competence, and connection. So if we can embed community relevant topics in the curriculum and include the community and parents in learning, we'll build those 5 C's in our kids, and they will consequently thrive and become active citizens. For CSP, a few things we can do: valuing and sustaining languages and cultural practices in the classroom, acknowledging that schools are accountable to the community, so there's that sort of dependence there, and the curriculum connects to their cultural history. In these ways, we will be using counter-hegemonic strategies in education that for so long kept minority students at the margins and neglected the truth in education. So when we bolster community engagement in our schools, we bolster PYD and CSP, and here are the benefits: increased student achievement, improved attendance and behavior, enhanced staff understanding of community and family needs, and a stronger school reputation. So all of these are fairly intuitive as to why, but the gist is that when families and communities feel comfortable with a school and positive about how their children are learning, the students benefit because the caregivers have bought in, so to speak. So I'm going to give a few community bridging strategies that you can use in your classrooms and hopefully bring to your schools. The first one is civic engagement. So civic engagement includes, but is not limited to, voting, community gardens, volunteering, organizing, and participating in activism. This can take place in field trips or within the classroom and conversations that you're having. In her essay on how to bring civic engagement into the classroom beyond election season, Miller writes, civic engagement, including activism, can promote a sense of empowerment and purpose, help youth cope with stress, and develop community connections and social capital. So you see connection, which is one of the 5 C's, competence and confidence in that quote as well. So we want our students to have these conversations about their neighborhoods and the issues they see at play outside of the classroom, and to take action. So the next one is role models. And the literature showed that having community role models in the classroom also increased that sense of connection and care. So in a school case study that I was reading about, it was an all-Black school that was selected for its merit, but also for its unique curriculum and school structure. Admin found that community engagement had a positive impact on schools' performance and student achievement. So a few ways that they included the community in their curriculum was they had a freelance artist from the community teaching the art class. So they all knew this artist, they knew them as their art teacher, but also someone who was active and working in the community. And they did the same thing with clubs and classes like music, drama, poetry, chess, and robotics. Also at this school, community members and parents regularly come in and co-teach classes, which is very interesting. So the students can see their peers' parents coming in, they can see the opportunities within their neighborhood that they can strive to be like. Next, we have culturally sustaining curriculum. So the curriculum should be culturally sustaining in that it engages the community. So we know that we should be challenging hegemony in the classroom and involving students in the teaching process. So this can be done through non-traditional texts, topical debates, blending the students' home language into the classroom if you have Spanish speakers, and going on intentional field trips. At my school, we had the Mexican Independence Parade going through the neighborhood. So we all went outside and watched it, and the kids were very excited. So I think that's something that was very culturally sustaining. This is a quote from one of the students at the case study school from the previous slide. He writes, also, they teach so much about your background. This school informs you about your culture and history. The school goes into great detail about the people you have come from. In my opinion, this information has empowered me. This information about my ancestors really helps because I will always know who I am and where I come from. So I think that very beautifully shows how students can be empowered, build confidence, and build a connection with what they're learning when it relates to them. Finally, family outreach is very important in creating community and building student achievement. Parents should always be serving on advisory councils, making decisions about budgets, curriculum, or just general happenings at the school. And this doesn't have to be particularly formal. It can be informal conversations when the kids are getting picked up from school. It can happen through surveys that are sent to their email, public forums, focus groups, but the kids really need to see that their parents are involved in the classroom because the parents are then working with the teachers, building those relationships for the good of the child. So you can add this to your chart that you have in your notebook. I just mapped on some of the concepts and strategies that I just spoke about in my section onto our C's here. So you'll see role models and civic engagement are with connection. Culturally sustaining curriculum is in competence. Family outreach is in confidence. So you can pause the video and take some time to take those notes.
Okay, so our second implication for CSP and positive youth culture is school structure. Now, this is going to come a lot from the lens of sort of an administrator, but a lot of the times this can be applicable for teachers too, because teachers get put on committees for school-wide decisions. So that's one place where it will be applicable to your guys' lives. Okay, so first thing we want to do here is define school climate. Okay, school climate is an administrator-led atmosphere based on culture, status structures, and policies of adults. Each of those are really important here. And we've sort of got three levels of people in our school, right, that really affect our students directly. We go administrator, right, and each of their decisions affects our teachers. And then each teacher decision affects the students. So you can imagine that like it sort of branches out a little bit wider with each group. And really, we're trying to cultivate this culture that supports students to form the whole person, right? And we want to start that by making the right decisions with the administrators at the beginning. So with youth culture, it tends to reflect adult culture a lot of the time, right? So if adults in your building are talking trash about other adults in the building, right, that might get reflected by the students. Status hierarchies tend to exist. Adults tend to validate those hierarchies. So, you know, if the most popular students in the school are the athletes and the public speakers, adults tend to validate those kids, and that will sometimes marginalize the students that don't get validated. And then peer culture has gained power as family and school climates continue to diverge. So that just tells us that high school is really important for students, and it really has an effect on their well-being. So that's sort of why we think this is important. All right, so some of Paris and Alim's thoughts. Here's a quote from them. Increasingly, we can no longer assume that the white middle-class linguistic, literate, and cultural skills and ways of being that were considered the sole gatekeepers to the opportunity structure in the past will remain so as our society changes, right? So we've learned that even though we used to teach from this sort of white Eurocentric framework, we've learned that multilingualism and multiculturalism is actually super valuable in the real world. So our goal as teachers then is to change our pedagogical framework. And instead of attempting to fix the achievement gap, we want to reframe that fixing, and instead we'd like to use students as assets, right? Our students of color who have previously been marginalized. We want to legitimize their opinions, their thoughts, their study habits, their strategies, their experiences, and use those as assets. All right, so one of the things that's really important to create in a school is relational trust. Now, administrators actually have a lot more control over this than you might think. So relational trust is trust built by the interpersonal social exchanges that take place in a group setting. More relational trust correlates with high student achievement. And then we have these, individual goals of some students become shared goals, right? And if we can do that school-wide, that's really great. So some of the strategies that we have that help build relational trust are block schedules, right? A lot of the time with block schedules, you can have team teaching. So if you have two teachers in the same classroom, they're working together, they're cooperating, they're collaborating. Students see that, students want to do the same thing, and it's a great situation for everybody. Looping, now this is a really tough one in high schools. I think it's easier to do in elementary schools, but if you really wanted to commit to this, looping is where a teacher stays with the same group of students from 1 year and through to the next year as well. So that's something that helps with relational trust. Minimal tracking, right? Not putting everybody on a track from freshman year all the way through senior year, right? And because if you create that, oh, we have this like college prep track and then we have a general education track, right? That just automatically creates a power difference there that we don't really want, and that sort of it sort of diminishes relational trust within the school. Diversified classrooms is another really important one. We read an article about how you can have desegregated schools, right? But you might still have segregated classrooms. So it's important to make sure that your actual classroom experiences are diverse, not just the school as a whole, right? A lot of the time, our more advanced classes can be filled with white and Asian students, where our less advanced classes can end up being filled with Black and Latinx students. So that's really something we're trying to avoid. And if we detrack, we can also avoid that. Also, small schools are good, and they lead to low student to teacher ratio, which correlates for high relational trust. All right. The Catholic advantage here. So the Catholic advantage is really great because Catholics do this thing called academic press. Yeah, they're really strict. And we also have a second type of school structure, which is called communal structure. Now, in the past, these two things have been thought to be mutually exclusive, but Eccles actually thinks that we can do these things together. So to go along with all those academic press things that I'm sure you guys know about, some communal school strategies are a caring and committed staff who take responsibility for student education, right? So if you're meeting in multidisciplinary meetings with other teachers and making personalized plans for students, that's great. School culture that encourages risk-taking, self-governance, professional collegiality, and then again, the low student to teacher ratio is an aspect of communal school strategies, right? So again, combining communal school strategies with the academic press that correlates for high academic achievement can really build interrelational trust and create like a more wholesome school. All right, I think this is just about our last one here. Implications for school leadership. So one thing that I read about was this pedagogy called Indigenous Decolonizing School Leadership. So this is a new pedagogy that focuses on framing our teaching and curriculum around the experiences of these Indigenous and Indigenous students and students of color. So some things that us as school leaders, whether that's as a teacher or an administrator, we can ask ourselves these three things. One, is my school enacting colonizing teaching practices that oppress and marginalize students of color? Okay. Two, how do our leadership practices and prior knowledge how are they influenced by a Eurocentric framework? Right. I think that's a really important one, right? Because all of our practices that have been like handed down to us, right? Everything that we learn tends to come from a Eurocentric framework. You know, when I walk into my chemistry classroom and the chemistry teacher before me is telling me, hey, I did things this way, I did things this way, I did things this way, right? A lot of those things have just been built from that Eurocentric framework. So if we can avoid that or shift the frame a little bit, that would be great. And then lastly, consider leading with Indigenous decolonizing school leadership with those communities involved, right? And that's always something that we want to do. Okay, so we have some new additions to our 6 C's here. I believe we've got multidisciplinary staff meetings. We have advisory meetings, looping, block schedule, and low student to teacher ratio, detracking, and IDSL in a diverse classroom experience. And other than that, I think I'm going to throw it over to Mallory. I don't know if it stopped. I think it stopped. It did. Oh, wait.
Hello, I'm Mallory, and I will be doing this section on literacy education. And don't click away if you don't teach ELA, because this is going to be especially for you. We have to start where all things should start. Speaking of Vygotsky. So Vygotsky is a great influencer of psychological development. He saw cognitive development as socially mediated and believed that intellectual power depends on culture, So you can see where this connects to culturally sustaining pedagogy, the idea that a student's culture is how they learn and how they gain power in society. Vygotsky believed that language was required for the generation and continuation of culture, and therefore the way we teach language and treat language in the classroom matters a lot for empowering our students. Here are 3 terms that you might have heard before and that I will be using in this section of the presentation. The first is mainstream American English, or what I'll refer to as MAE. This is a dialect of English spoken by most Americans, especially the white, middle, and upper classes. It is the language of schools. African American English, AAE, is a dialect of English spoken by many, but not all African Americans, and by others in some American urban centers. The last one, ELL, is English language learners, and these are students who are learning English as a new language. A majority of the research I did for this section focuses on AAE, but the strategies that are included in this section will ring true for ELLs as well, and other students that speak dialects other than MAE. So this could include rural dialects and other urban dialects outside of AAE. So AAE has long been understood as an inferior or lazy form of American English. We know this to not be true. Linguists recognize no inherent superiority or inferiority in dialects or languages. They are all equally systematic, rule-governed, and regular. And this quote stood out to me, that each dialect language is suited to the needs of the community that they serve. This speaks to Vygotsky's understanding that language is how culture is passed on from one generation to another. So the language of a group is created to best serve them and serve their needs, and speaks to what's important to the group and the assets of their culture. So some problems surrounding language in the classroom as it relates to dialects other than MAE. There's implicit bias due to systems of power that favor MAE over other dialects of English. And this leads to low expectations of students who speak dialects other than MAE. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. There's also a damaging assumption among educators and standardized test makers that all students have an equal understanding of MAE and can apply it to situations, word problems in math, word problems in science. And I will talk more about that later as well. This quote speaks to what we can do as teachers to combat this problem in our schools. It is not a bag of tricks, but the general attitude of a teacher that is important. We're going to get into some specific things that we can do as teachers in the classroom to combat the damage done by MAE domination in the classrooms, but it is how you think about your students and how you care about your students that matters at the end of the day. So if you are intentional about the way that you treat language in your classroom and the way that you think about it, your students will notice, it will improve their education, and it will make these tips that I'm going to share with you meaningful for your students. The way this section of the presentation is structured is some problems in education and some solutions. So Latson Billings, the creator of culturally sustaining pedagogy, that term that we've been using, also coined this phrase, permission to fail. This is a tendency of teachers to have low expectations of students that speak non-standard dialects of English, most notably AAE. She speaks about students who struggle writing, reading, and speaking MAE in the classroom. Teachers assume that the student isn't smart, isn't able to participate fully with MAE, and therefore doesn't hold them to the same expectations as other students. And this is extremely damaging as it's allowing those students to fall behind. So this relates to what we've spoken about in other parts of our presentation, the need for high expectations for all students. Another problem is the hidden curriculum of language. Language and the fact that there are many, many dialects of American English is not often talked about in the classroom, and that's a problem. So a solution is explicit instruction in the classroom about language. Students and teachers need to learn about the formation of language. This will help to eliminate that belief that AAE is somehow a lazy form of English or a lesser form of English. Differences between oral MAE and AAE need to be made explicit as well. The connotations of power related to bias surrounding dialects, that discussion of systems of power that lead to these stereotypes and opinions about non-MAE dialects of English. And helping students recognize the difference between home and school English is going to help them in that code switching process that they have to do at schools and in broader society in order to participate. Another problem is how to correct spelling and grammar mistakes related to students' dialects. So instead of saying a spelling or a grammatical form is wrong, you can move that conversation from correctness to appropriateness. So helping students recognize and learn by explicitly telling them, this is how we need to write when we're at school or when we're writing something formal versus how they speak at home or in their community. And explicitly teaching common spelling rules is going to be helpful for students as well. Seeing AAE as a deficit, as a problem we need to fix, as some lesser form of English, as something we need to encourage students to get away from, is extremely damaging and does not speak to the benefits of positive youth development. The solution is to recognize AAE and other dialects as an asset in your classroom. Students who code switch possess an incredible skill. That is a difficult thing to do. It takes energy, it takes a lot of thought, and recognizing that work that they do and making it easier for them whenever you can is going to be very important. It's important that we connect literacy skills students already have to conventional literary forms necessary in class. This article from Latson and Billings gave a great example of using music in the classroom as a means of teaching narrative, as a means of teaching poetry. So that can fall into an ELA classroom very easily. And it's an important part of culturally sustaining pedagogy that reading and writing are meaningful tasks for students. You could apply this to what Kate was talking about with civic engagement, making things meaningful for them and community-based. And this is my last slide before we get back to our table. You might be saying, but Mallory, I don't teach English language arts. I don't either. So this is for all content. We all need to recognize the role of language in our classrooms, and we all need to be advocates for our students in supporting them in reading and writing skills. All content areas require vocabulary, the readings of symbols and formulas, and all word problems, etc., involve cultural biases. So there are linguistic biases. In word problems, we may favor MAE spellings, grammatical forms, etc., and content bias, asking students about things that we assume they experience, but they don't actually, especially if your culture does not match the culture of your students. You can combat content bias by asking students questions about something that you know they're familiar with, instead of saying, when you went on a cruise with your family, on vacation, instead ask questions about things you know they're familiar with. Using school, your school in your examples is a great thing because you know all of your students have experienced your school. There is a set of questions you can go through. It's called CBLA as you're looking at the reading and writing that you're asking your students to do. Asking these 4 questions will help you recognize ways that you can make your work more accessible to students who speak different dialects and whose culture does not match your own. What does the task require? What do you really need to know your students know how to do? Simplify the language, not the math, is one of the quotes from this section of an article. And I think that's a really good way to think about it. Think about your objective, what you need to know your kid knows, and make that as easy for them to show as possible. What does the student currently do? What are the assets they are bringing to the table? What is it that they're already familiar with? What can you connect to make this new learning meaningful for them? What might the student learn to do differently? So here you can help scaffold things for your students, help them make those connections, and come up with unique ways to teach them these new skills. How should the curricular task or broader context be modified? How can you make your word problems more relatable to your students? How can you bring in readings and materials that are going to speak to them and help them understand this new learning? So these are questions to go through and ask yourself as you're ensuring that the reading and writing necessary for your course is going to be equally accessible to all students. And here is our final table, so you can complete your notes. And we just added some meaningful curriculum, that CBLA framework, and you can see places where these overlap and our 3 sections overlapped. And now Raymond will finish us up. Thank you so much.
Throughout this presentation, we've been talking about some 3 pretty distinct spheres: community engagement, school structure, and language acquisition, literacy education. We know that these are 3 different topics, but what unites them all is the table that you've created. Culturally sustained pedagogy and positive youth development are jargony terms. The one word that I think you do need to take away from this presentation is asset. Our students, their cultures, their communities, these are things for us to come to know and come to use in our classrooms to respect. And so long as we keep a focus on our students as assets, as having assets, the funds of knowledge they bring, their literacy abilities, and just everything else that they come to us with, you'll be in a good spot. So thank you for listening to our presentation. If you're extremely curious, here are our references. Give them a read, should you choose. Pause the video if you like. But thank you for listening today, and we look forward to your questions.